while we get ready for our next session, I just want to thank a few of the people who have made today possible for us. First of all, we have the team from CT Ireland, who have been amazing today. This looks like a NASA cockpit, and they are continuously doing amazing things here. And I want to thank Katie, Joe, and Pat on cameras, Matt on lighting, Fernando with the Zoom magic, Ian and Paloma on sound, and Ian on PowerPoint as well. We have Lucy Newsom, who is walking around and taking beautiful photos, and we have Mark and Xavier from Harrison Media, who are capturing you for immortality. And so with that, we are ready for our next panel. The next panel is on the future of SaaS, and we will have a group of amazing speakers here, led by Christian Reimsbach. Christian is an information economist and policy analyst at the OECD's Directorate for Science, Technology, and Innovation. He has focused on the impact of digital technologies and the role of big data in economic growth and societal well-being. Prior to joining the OECD, he conducted research at the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology and SAP research in Germany. Please welcome Christian.
I would like to take this opportunity maybe first to thank the organizers, Jack and the team, for inviting me to chair this excellent panel. And I would like also to invite maybe the other panelists to join me. I won't introduce all of them. I think it will be much more efficient if they will introduce themselves as they speak. And if I may say so, while the panelists are joining, I think this is, personally, I think this is maybe the most important panel, if I may say so, of the whole event. And the reason why I'm saying that is because we are obviously talking about the future of SaaS, and if you talk about the future of SaaS, you talk about the future of the internet, and if you talk about the future of the internet, you talk about the future of the digital economy, and thus of the future of the whole economy. And with that, having set the expectation right, let me go straight with a question as a kind of an introduction. And the question I would like to start our panel is, how do you see the role of SaaS evolving from your respective perspective, and what emerging trend or technologies are you particularly excited about when it comes in about pets? And with that, maybe Jack, you can start.
Sure. I hope that wasn't too positive an intro. I don't know how to follow this next. So the world of SaaS is worth a huge amount, as you said, a huge part of the economy. I think McKinsey estimated last year that it was a $4 trillion market already, and it's expected to grow to like 10 trillion by... These numbers, I don't even know how many zeros that is, but it's more than I can fathom for the time being. But actually, if you look at SaaS or anything like that, it's about trust, right? You typically, as an organization, you want to build all of the tools yourself. You want to be able to allow other organizations to take advantage of, maybe lean engineering teams, that they can build a service that's useful to many people and thus cost efficient, right? And in doing so, you're usually sending them information to allow them to process it, to store it on your behalf, and for you to hopefully get the advantage of it. So how SaaS works today typically is that you have to trust the supplier in this scenario, right? So the SaaS provider. And how you do that usually is through lawyers. So you probably don't even read, I mean, a lot of people don't even read the legal T's and C's, but there's a T and C typically at the bottom of the website, and there's a privacy policy, etc. And that's basically how the SaaS provider says how they're going to handle your data, how, what security mechanisms they're going to have in place, how your data is going to be used, etc. I think if you look at privacy policies as a whole over the kind of broad stretch, very often there's an inclination not to get sued. So people try to use like catch-all terms like automatic data. They're not specific really on certain details of it. And ultimately, it's kind of a flawed system because the only way you know if they've broken it is if there's like a data leak or if you sue them, right? And you can't go around suing everyone, right? That's not a very productive use of the world. And so ultimately, you try to trust something else, and certification becomes a natural part of that. So usually, you look for SOC 2 or ISO 2700 series, blah, blah, blah. which means that they have a set of rules which they kind of partially created themselves, and then they collect data on their day-to-day processes, and then they get an auditor in for a couple of weeks, once a year, to then say, yeah, that seems like it matched, at least on a subset of the data, like saying like a financial auditor or something like that. But it's a very weak form of trust, but that's actually how the whole world kind of works today. And I think that if you look at lots of big organizations, I'm really interested to hear people's reflections from their organizations, is that like Amazon builds all their own tools because they're not going to send stuff out. If I have a call with another organization that has their own voice over IP system between Blue Jeans and Chime and Teams and Zoom and everything else, I think I'll lose my mind. So everyone builds their own stuff internally at the really big organizations scale. And I think that that's just a flawed system, and pets seem to offer a way that you can actually trust those suppliers and not have to worry about some of those concerns. And to be honest, in the spectrum of pets, because there's lots of really useful stuff that's been talked about today, but I think, and maybe the reason we have the composition of the panelists, is that confidential compute or secure enclaves or trusted execution environments seem to be the way that you might actually be able to broker those APIs to offer trust, where it's the big boys in the room, it's the infrastructure providers, the chip manufacturers, et cetera, who are actually the ones brokering that trust between organizations potentially all over the world. So that's how I think pets really have a fighting chance to change how we interact with each other in no matter what area your business is.
If I could come in on that as well. I think the first time I heard the expression, the future of SaaS, was in 2016. It was Mark Russinovich, CTO, still CTO of Microsoft, right?
Oh, yeah.
CTO of Microsoft, where Mark came to us at Intel and said, hey, maybe we shouldn't publicly quote this, but he said, hey, we've got some issues, right? We're trying to drive what we call platform services, because that's where we want to monetize at that level. But the problems that we have are threefold. One, privacy has become a thing, right? 2015, 2016, we were getting ready for GDPR, et cetera, et cetera. We have a tsunami of compliance coming, right, down the way. HIPAA got stronger, GDPR was coming, et cetera, plus trust in the cloud has been eroded, right? You can go back to Snowden and all the other things like that Catherine talks about and stuff like that as well, right? So that whole area was the first time that I had heard Russinovich say the future of SaaS is on the line, right? So this is where the likes of Intel and Microsoft, GCP, AWS, et cetera, got together to see how we could bridge this gap. Jack talked about enclaves earlier on in his talk, and that really became a defining point from the confidential computing journey to divert some of the work that we were doing on a client technology, how do we secure keys on your laptops, into the data center. And that began the growth of that. But the aim has been from that day in 2016 to now is to bring SaaS-based solutions at a platform level. It's not about infrastructure, right? It's about getting the infrastructure bedded in so we can build over-the-top cloud-native services in a confidential way using a mix of privacy technologies. We're not there yet, and maybe Simon can expand a little bit more on this. We're still innovating at the infrastructure layer, but when I talked to one of the world's biggest airlines a couple of weeks ago, they told me, we can't spell Kubernetes, right? We just want you to give us a tick box to click that will make me compliant and will encrypt everything. And I think Microsoft are well down the journey of that with things like SAP HANA, et cetera, et cetera. So the future of SaaS has been debated for quite a while now, and we're still debating it. We're almost there, I think. We're probably still a couple of years away. Simon?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Where I landed that, so I worked for Microsoft, but prior to that, was the cloud CTO for a large Swiss bank for a number of years. So to me, SaaS is essentially the kind of ultimate evolution of what we have in cloud, right? So that's the ultimate end goal. You don't really want to have to be going out inventing stuff. And if you look over time, what happens is, there's innovations that happen at the infrastructure layer. They start to get industrialized, and that's the whole story of cloud all the way through. And I think we're at the kind of mid-step of that, where we're taking some of those silicon innovations that are really required to enable some of the, what we position with confidential compute in Azure. You need those infrastructure innovations then to start percolating up through the rest of the platform. So you're really going from novel through to common adoption and then industrialization, and that's where that then just becomes, I think, a common capability that everybody can start to consume. Right? And I think that's where that ultimately, let's say, the ultimate evolution of where things are going with SaaS. And you have to, as you say, to be able to do that and meet those kind of privacy requirements, particularly given, SaaS is very fundamentally multi-tenanted, right? It's not like you can do with infrastructure, you can silo stuff off, but at scale, that's very inefficient. You want to get to that kind of model where that's essentially managed in a single system. The only way you can really do that is through that kind of infrastructure technology, which then enables the pets that sit on top of it, and then give people kind of real technically defensible positions, as you say. I mean, so in my 7 years at the Swiss bank, right, every outsourcing program I worked on where we were taking, you first go through the argument of, let's not break the whole SaaS model by coming and deploying our own version of it in our own data center, because that does away with the entire value of it. And you then need to get into, as you say, it's back-to-back legal agreements between different entities and organizations and contracting entities. It's almost kind of, I used to call it shift left for blame, because it's kind of, you're essentially saying, well, he said it was okay, and she said it was okay, and it just trickles down like that. And there's not really, without those kind of privacy-enhancing technologies, there isn't really a proper legally defensible and technically defensible position where you say, look, we don't have access to this stuff, right? It's your data, you as the customer own and control the life cycle of where it goes.
I think just to add on to that, I think you said pretty much what I was going to cover, but I think for me, the SaaS kind of model has really expanded as well, and it's almost like a joint responsibility model at this point with the APIs and the way I can extend my kind of SaaS experience. And I guess the tick box approach, I have a lot of customers who just want that tick box, which is great. That happens once a year. But I have a lot of customers who actually now want constant signals. They don't want to know their FIPS or ISO, but they need to guarantee their own internal compliance through getting signals from the platform. And I think pets can really help with the kind of evolution of that journey for CISOs and other people within large organizations to get that comfort and that compliance, in real time, as it were.
There are two questions that I have that follows from what you said. The very first one was actually triggered by you, Jack, when you basically started by saying that a lot of the current system is relying on, let's say, legal agreements between the different parties. And I think this was kind of confirmed throughout the different intervention. And it basically raised a question for me, does it mean that when using pets, we can essentially get rid of all the lawyers that the companies have? Is that really true? Or what will be the future of the lawyers in this kind of new world where pets will really become a reality? And the second, and it may be a related question to that, and it actually also has been inspired by your talk this morning, where you basically highlighted one of the challenges related to trusted execution environments, saying that we need to have trust at the hardware layer. And I would probably add on top of that, we probably need to have trust in the whole stack that builds on top of the hardware layer. And the question is, how can we ensure that trust? Or how can we ensure that those different layers are trustworthy?
If I could take the first one out of there, it's difficult to say. I don't think really you're going to get rid of lawyers, and ultimately that's the wrong thing to do, because lawyers do, as much as maybe we hate lawyers as much as they hate IT people, right? Because they have to fix their printers, etc. But they are required. It's a different skill set, but they are, the legal profession are providing, good grounding, legal advice based on principles, precedents, all that kind of stuff. Now, I think you'll never do away with that, and if you are under the illusion you can do away with that entirely, you're in for a rough ride, right? Because you're going to get sued somewhere down the line. But you need someone who can then understand how that works, but be able to take advantage of some of those promises that are provided by the platform, right? And understand the technical evidences that are being provided. I spend a lot of time, in my role with confidential compute, talking about attestation, right? Which is a technical thing, but it's around how we provide cryptographically protected proofs that things are protected the way they should be, and no one's messing around with it in the back, around the back of the stage to make things happen. And I think really there's that kind of growing understanding that happens with the legal profession, and then ultimately it's kind of a combination between the trust that you get through contracting, but backed up with proof that you can back up to when the auditors come in, as long as they understand it. You're saying, look, here's the proof of it, rather than this, like I say, this kind of ongoing chain of, well, he said it was okay, she said it was okay, and having to chase that all the way down the drain hole.
I think there's 3 levels to that as well. I think there's the trust, I think there's attestation, but I think it's the verification point as well. So it's having like an independent third-party verification, and that has to happen more than that kind of once a year piece.
Yeah, just an important point of what you said. You talked about the software stacks and stuff like that. With technologies like confidential computing, they're out of the trust base, right? You don't have to trust them is the whole point, right? And to make this super simple, you can do operations on someone else's computer without them knowing or influencing what's going on that computer, even if the operating system is hacked, even if the hypervisor is hacked. The TCB, or the trusted computing base that we have, for example, on Azure, is tiny. You can bring that down to the level of a function, right? And as Simon said, there's 3 parts to this. There's the runtime encryption element, which we've just described, encrypted data being processed. The second part of that is how you manage your keys. Very, very important how you do that. And the third part is integrity. And this integrity piece is critical because you want that integrity certificate before you actually decrypt your data inside a trusted execution environment. If you combine those 3 together, it's very, very powerful, right? Plus, you get to use the economics of the cloud for large AI type of workloads, et cetera, et cetera. So it's quite compelling. Some people don't like the fact that data is decrypted inside of an enclave, but for 80, 90% of use cases, that's fine, right?
I think there might also be an interesting question here about how we even... So, okay, if we were to say we could use confidential compute as basically a trusted broker between the IP provided of a SaaS producer and the data that's coming in from an individual client. So the attestation that we've talked about basically signs off, like the infrastructure provider is signing off kind of like a contract saying,
or an independent authority.
Or an independent authority, sorry, is signing off that, the software, if you have the software, you can verify that it's inside the...
And it's a genuine trusted execution environment.
Exactly, yeah. So in that context, if the software inside takes data from person A and gives it to person B, well, it's doing exactly what it says it's doing. It's just that's not very private, right? I mean, that's the case. So the question might also be, does SaaS look the way like SaaS does today? So today, often you get an API. So your code just hits some endpoint. It does something, and then maybe it gives you something back. And that's kind of, you're at arm's length. You don't touch the infrastructure. Another paradigm that I don't know which one, I'll get your 2 cents on, is whether or not within your cloud, your own infrastructure, you spin up some enclaves internally, and the IP comes to you. Because that way you kind of got your data residency, your data is not leaving your infrastructure, but you can do something that's, you trust, but you verify. Because even outside of the enclave, you can just see that no data is leaving your infrastructure. So if there's a consistent way that SaaS providers can offer their solutions consistent, because there's not that many clouds, and there's not, most of it's through cloud. So a consistent way that they can deploy it and offer it almost to the internal clouds of these different organizations, maybe that's a way that the CISOs can sleep at night a little bit.
And I think even there's some examples of that with the likes of Beekeeper AI, for example, or pushing AI around using trusted execution environments, et cetera. But that area is the area I think that we need to innovate a lot more on. I think this whole concept right now, it's sort of cloud first. It either happens in the cloud or it's a struggle outside of the cloud. But that's kind of where we're going over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think the other kind of interesting aspect of that is, a lot of my time in my previous organization was spent looking at insider threats, right? One of your own internal staff exfiltrating data, running off with it, trying to sell it to a competitor, those kind of things. Now, within the scope of an individual organization, right, you typically manage that on trust today, right? We background screen people, we have some degree of supervision over what they're doing, but a lot of it is really based around trust. But when you scale that up to a SaaS type environment, you've now got hundreds, thousands maybe of customers in that single SaaS platform. That insider threat vector, it's no longer really acceptable just to say, we are SaaS provider X and we trust our admins, right? Because that doesn't fly. And particularly if you want to onboard people from regulated industries, particularly financial services and healthcare, insider threats are a really big topic with their regulators. And you need then to be adopting that kind of technological barrier that goes just beyond, well, Dave's not in this group, so he can't access that. Right? You now go to the point where even super admin of the system can't get in and look at the data. And I think that's a scaling thing. Right? And given what I said earlier with that, to me, SaaS being almost the kind of end game for everything in the cloud, right? That needs to be there as part of that.
If I may follow up on that, because at the OECD, when we looked at privacy-enhancing technologies, one of the challenges that came up was actually the need for certain regulators in certain countries to make sure that pets didn't have any kind of backdoors. So, and this basically leads to the question, how do you really ensure the necessary level of transparency that you can communicate to a regulator in, let's say, some countries, not only within the OECD, but also outside some of the OECD countries that are, let's say, concerned about certain types of technologies. And I wonder if you had that experience and how you basically dealt with those regulators when they came up and said, we want to have the proof that it's safe.
Yeah, so in the last sort of 7 years, dealing with pretty much every regulator around the world, right? They always seem to follow a kind of a circle, to my mind, right? It starts very much we've read this white paper about this technology. This sounds interesting. Nothing happens. Next audit comes around. It's like, have you thought about using technology X? No, okay, it's maybe a bit immature. And that's really going to start coming, for me, it's going to start coming full circle from regulators that I worked with starting to go, well, we've heard about these privacy-enhancing technologies. Are you doing it? And you say, well, no, maybe not yet. That's going to start turning, right? As all of those cycles do, it's going to turn very much from a have you thought about to a we really think you should do. And the ultimate goal of that, or the ultimate where that will end up, is the regulators mandating those sort of technologies. Because that will, certainly, what I see happening is there are certain regulators around the world that almost act as the leaders. You have certain regulators in certain countries make decisions. The other regulators go, well, they said that. And then they all follow on from that. And I think it's very much going to turn from a, nice to have, should be doing, to a you must do. And you're going to get to the point where you then have to explain in front of a regulator why you are not using privacy-enhancing technologies. And that's a multi-year thing, but I think that's ultimately where that's going to end up.
I think that's a big opportunity for SaaS providers to become leaders and innovators in this space. And I think, as same as you, I have a lot of experience in banking, and it goes from collaborating to being dictated to. So I think there's a point in the future where the SaaS industry needs to take that kind of leadership role and rather be dictated and be on the back foot and reacting. I think it's super important for a whole industry.
If I may, does it actually mean that you see SaaS providers playing a role as a trusted third parties when it comes to, let's say, the whole data ecosystem? Is it fair to say, to summarize it that way?
Potentially, but I think it's more like a trust element more than anything. So this kind of trust me, it's okay, to here's why you can trust me, and here's why we're working with regulators to kind of evolve the industry, and compliance and regulation is a huge opportunity in this industry.
Especially the cloud-native platforms, right? So, you could look at what Databricks have done recently. Databricks is it's an incredible company, right? And but one of the challenges they have in Europe is that they can't get regulated companies to use Databricks, right? So telcos, for example, want to move their analytics engines onto Databricks, on Azure or GCP or whatever. And now, Azure's come out with a confidential computing version, Databricks has come out with a confidential computing version of Databricks, albeit built on AMD SEV. What's going on there, Simon? But albeit built on AMD, but it's been hugely successful. Like in the first 6 weeks of their launch, sign-ups from telcos wanting to get off on-prem stuff into the cloud, garner that cloud economics, and dial down cost. Because in all of these SaaS platforms, it's about how you can make money for your organization or how you save money, right? And the cloud is one way of doing the second.
And I do think, cloud providers, be they, PaaS all the way through, IaaS through to SaaS, the motivation is there for those organizations, including the one I work with. Most of the hyperscalers aren't there to monetize customer data. Azure doesn't do, we don't analyze data and sell inference patterns off the back of it, right? To be frank, the arrangement is we'd rather you gave us your data and paid us to host it, and we're quite happy to make sure that only you have access to it, right? And that's a neat trade-off. But the reality of that is it means that if you can get to a much more technological barrier between the two, it's much easier then for Azure to have those conversations with all the FSIs, the healthcare organizations, which means reach. So it's mutually beneficial, but as I say, I think it then means that not only Azure, because the other hyperscalers are doing efforts in this space as well. That's I think where we start to see that leadership.
I mean, if I may then follow up with another question that I had. That kind of was inspired by also the topic is, it seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the whole, let's say, use of, let's say, trusted execution environment or secured enclave in the context of SaaS actually means that private cloud won't be necessary. Is this true? And does it actually mean that, let's say, the companies, let's say, the HPs and Dells of the world, are actually being threatened by that, by pets and trusted execution environments?
I mean, one of the taglines, sorry for jumping in this.
I went for Azure, you don't want me to answer that.
So Simon's bosses. Favorite expression is make the public cloud your private cloud with confidential computing. It's a bit cheesy, but it kind of sticks, and I think people get the model on that.
I was just going to say, so if you look at the evolution of confidential compute on cloud generally, when they first launched, even now, like I think the biggest kind of push has been around insider threat, etc. And so typically you have a KMS in your cloud, like a key management system of sorts, right? So that's where all the keys get dumped, and then based on whatever instance or whatever role a user has or whatever, they're able to get access to a key to unlock data to do something. And so the confidential compute as it went up was very much tied to the key management systems in the different clouds. And I think now there's more and more solutions as well where you can have that key management system on premises. So you can encrypt your data, you can stick it in the cloud, and from, not a big machine anymore sitting in the back of the office, you can have very strict rules about when that data can be encrypted, for what use and how, and otherwise it gets... So the internal threats, which isn't SaaS, I realize you're drifting here, but is kind of it's a outsourcing of compute from on-premises to a cloud, which is kind of a similar concept here. I think is as the key management systems are coming, like staying on premises, it's kind of changing that game as well. And I think the truth of it is, even if you have great developers and IT managers and all the rest, like data does end up in Splunk files, log files, data can be left fragmented behind on servers, etc. And how this is shifting is basically saying, you don't have to worry about that anymore. We'll keep it isolated. It gets wiped as soon as it's done processing, and you can have very clear rules about when that data is allowed to be used, which once again will tie into your data minimization, your overall data governance practices. You can have clear controls of when your data is used for what purposes, by what processes, etc. And you can probably even log it very well too.
That's a great point, because I was talking to someone this morning, I can't remember, but if I go back to my backstory of how we started this, we were focused on data breach, right? It was all about data breach. How can we stop data breaches? Now it's about how you use data for the purposes for which it was collected, right? It's not that nobody cares about data breaches, but if you've got privacy by design, you could show you did all the right things, your business is not going to go out of business anymore. GDPR is not going to hammer you too badly. But to your point, it's all about how do I control this data for the purposes for which it is. Now, that's bringing challenges in and of itself. We talk about large language models. Is data going to continue to go to the cloud? Are people going to start sitting on data again? It's flowing each way, I think. So that's one to watch, where we go with that.
Yeah, I think there's even a slight variant of that, right? It's so SaaS of a kind, right? So you can take now various services to get your Windows or Linux, etc., desktop running in the cloud, right? So one of the biggest programs I ever worked on was a very large desktop virtualization program, centralized with VDI. And I always use the example with this, every organization does the right thing in terms of securing the application servers and databases. And there's a lot of monitoring that goes around that. But the great unwashed, dirty bit is the desktop that sits on your desk, right? Because in reality, what happens is people take dumps of that data, it goes into that terrible tool that we made sell. People do all of that data analysis that runs every business in the world. And unfortunately, the barriers then start to get a bit blurred, right? Which is, again, one of the things we look at is if you can then start to extend some of that confidential compute technology to those desktops hosted in the cloud, you can take that similar level of protection that you apply to your application servers at the right level. You can start to do that for the desktops as well, which covers a lot of those bases.
Sorry, do you mean virtual desktops?
Yeah, so if you're going to
remote log in, but you're now logged into an enclave.
Yeah,
with
so the data at rest only ever lives and is processed in the cloud. You just make
Azure virtual desktop running in a confidential computing instance. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. You can use enclaves for those things like break glass environments, for those air-gapped environments as well, to stop those leakage of data in that desktop environment as well, which takes kind of pets right to the desktop. And I think that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and I see that something as, a lot of the big financials, did this 3 or 4 years ago. They all moved to those kind of centralized farms, and you see that's a much more common pattern now. And you can get, you call it desktop as a service, but it's a similar pattern to SaaS, right? You just get a Windows or Linux or whatever desktop, and you stick your data in it, and you do your stuff.
But just Christian, on the SaaS thing, and because we've talked about enclaves a lot here, right? So, at Intel, obviously, confidential computing is a big bet for us, but we see, the convergence of privacy-enhancing technologies as the sort of final solution here, if you will, right? So, working with SMPC companies, homomorphic encryption companies, and bringing them together. So there's no reason to think that, some SaaS providers couldn't embrace a different technology, made even more robust by using, the tools that are in the cloud as well. So it's important that SaaS is not just all about the cloud and confidential computing in the cloud. There's more technologies at play.
And if I may follow up on your point, Paul, because we have been also talking a lot about basically SaaS providers essentially as a user of pets. And I wonder if there is also a future for SaaS providers essentially providing privacy-enhancing technology as a service, where they basically, if you see this as a potential market. And maybe before you answer the question, I just wanted to remind the participants, we kindly have like 10 minutes, and I wanted to see if there are any questions that people on the floor have that they wanted to raise eventually. So if you have questions, could you just raise your hand so I have a sense of how many questions we can expect from the floor? I see 1, 2, no. Okay. So you still have time. You still have 10 minutes if you are interested or if you want to kind of formulate your question. So going back to my question, do you see a potential market for let's say, cloud providers to provide pets as a service, or is it something basically where you don't see a market for?
Could you clarify? So I would say confidential compute is a pet.
True.
And it's provided on every major cloud. And now there's different types of chip manufacturers. There's GPUs now coming on live. I mean, it's already a thing. It's there. If you're talking about output privacy or something, then absolutely. I mean, I join the competition tomorrow. You can get your hands dirty with differential privacy running inside of secure enclaves, and it fits into your regular Jupyter notebooks and stuff. And there's nothing special about that. I'm sure many other people have ideas of how you can try to combine these things, and then basically through the attestation have a guarantee that the sensitive data has only gone through one of the trusted output disclosure controls before being disseminated. So I would very much say yes, in my opinion. But
yeah, I would say, confidential compute to me is one of the enabling technologies for pets, right? I mean, in some use cases it is a pet by itself. You're absolutely right, but I think it's definitely part of that software stack. I mean, I'd certainly see, the various partners we work with, if I think of Decentric and people like that their service is essentially a SaaS service, and they specialize in a kind of data clean room type scenario, but that's very much where they push it. And I see several other kind of businesses in that space that we've come across.
Yeah, I agree with Simon. I think it's an enabling technology as well. I haven't seen anybody coming out with, I've seen one spin-off. I work a lot with our venture arm. I haven't seen anybody in this space. I've seen a lot of companies spinning up with secure AI, or sorry, examining your AI models for security, but not so much in this space. So there's an opportunity for someone out there in a startup to do this, right? So I think.
Yep. No, I'll just reiterate, Jack. I think all the major cloud providers are providing pets of some sort. I think confidential compute has been the kind of forerunner. I think there's rumblings that there's new things coming from the big three kind of cloud providers as well. To expand in that space.
Yeah, but that's the point, right? That you just made there. It's about, as we said earlier, the cloud providers coming up that infrastructure stack to offer platform services, so enabling their own technology to bring data clean rooms, for example, and confidential SaaS platforms.
Yeah.
That's the key point, right?
Yeah, and I think it's important that I may work for Microsoft, but it would be the worst thing in the world if all the three providers went off and did their own entirely different thing, and then obviously all of the the next kind of tier hyperscalers went off with their own different solutions. They were all completely different. I mean, that's the worst outcome for a customer possible. As much as it'd be great if everything was in Azure, but I think that's why industry standard bodies, Confidential Compute Consortium, for example, I think is important for some of that, because it helps kind of build towards making sure keeping everybody on the right track of what the common definition is of that tooling.
And that's why also companies like Intel are important, because we build the plumbing, right? So at some point you should be able to move containers between clouds, because the technology will be ubiquitous, as we discussed earlier on.
Exactly. No, but
I was just going to say, the last thing I would say, so in the space of pets, there's just some obvious things that people sometimes don't mention and probably should be mentioned. So one is, it's not greenfield. The world works in a certain way already. And realistically, for security standards, there's FIPS, there's all of the classic security standards already for the cryptographic methods that are used for hashing and digital signatures and TLS and everything the whole way through the stack. Confidential compute plays nice with them. And on top of that, as we said, they're now available on all. I would say, generally speaking, or at least one of the problems we try to solve is to make them more usable for the non-expert necessarily. Yeah. And there's others doing that too, so that's one of the steps that's happening. But in terms of like now or very near term as well, I think they're just accessible for, if you're a Python developer who knows how to make a fast API server, you can throw it in confidential compute. If you're a JavaScript developer who can build an API, you can throw it in. If you're a Java or a C or a Rust or you can actually use this, right? That's a major.
It's a really good point, because the barrier to some of the pets now is the depth that you require. Yeah. So working in like large banks and things to track that sort of technical talent at scale is a challenge. Yep. So getting that abstraction is absolutely critical to adoption.
I mean, the two biggest challenges are, you just said them, usability, right? You need a PhD in some of these cases to use some of the stuff that's going on at the moment. And the second is the skills gap. The skills gap is huge, right? Even at Intel here, we've been talking to the minister here locally about how we could get cybersecurity apprenticeships going, for example, right? To try and address that skills gap for the future. Mm-hmm. But unless we solve the usability problem, we'll be sitting here in 3 or 4 years' time talking about the same thing. And that's up to guys like you, right?
And this is definitely something that our work has also basically underlined, is the need for, or the challenge related to skills, and that this being basically one of the biggest barriers to adoption of privacy-enhancing technologies, which obviously then raises a question, to what extent are cloud service providers actually facilitating that by essentially maybe through the right interfaces and so on. And it seems that you would agree that there is at least, if not this is already the case, but there's definitely a potential here. And I could imagine that like your company is actually also, this is one of the promises that your company,
Try to gamify it, get pizza and beer for people, like start doing it, and like hopefully the snowball kind of grows over time.
So I saw a question, there was a question, at least one that someone had, I think, if the person could raise his or her hands again, or maybe the question was already addressed. So it was already addressed. So maybe I have one last question for the last 2 minutes that we have, which relates to the question of portability. And I think this is something we alluded to a little bit. But as you may be aware of, there is the European EU Data Act coming. And within that Data Act, there is a provision for calling or requiring or mandating the right to the portability of cloud service data. And I was wondering, because I'm not so familiar with the details, to what extent are those enclaves that we are talking about portable? So to what extent is it easy for a user to be able to switching providers, which is the purpose that the law had in mind, and where I would say competition authorities are looking at very carefully at the moment?
So there's definitely under the hood different technologies at play. I think a number of people, we try this, but also like Open Enclave, for example, there's a whole bunch of tools now that basically try to create a consistent interface so that you can build something and it will work pretty much the same across Intel and AMD chips. And I believe the new NVIDIA stuff is also in the same sphere of how they're going about it too. So there's a great effort to try to make it so that it's, you can build something and ship it to different clouds and use the different enclaves under the hood.
I think it always comes back to...
User locked-in is basically over. We don't have to worry about user lock-in anymore.
I'd say there's still a maturity of these technologies, if I'm totally honest, but it's happening. It's not like you have to wait 10 years before you're going to see it.
The technology will come to do this, right? So, we'll have chips that are coming out later this year that will be in all data centers. They look the same, right? And that sounds really easy. But the economics of actually doing it and plugging it into some other cloud's API versus, Azure API versus it'll be astronomical. So it's okay to write this in the law. But will anybody ever do it because of the economics? We'll have to wait and see. But over time, it will get easier. I mean, we have Kubernetes containers that are supposed to look the same in every cloud, right? Are they?
Yeah.
But the point was made earlier as well about, the worst thing would be that the three hyperscalers have different kind of technologies and different standards for it. That being said, if you have an innovative, novel approach to this, the laws are going to mean that I then have to create some migration assistant or some way to get out. So it almost like dilutes, the value of what I'm, innovating on.
I would say the most portable thing between all the clouds is IaaS, right? But if you're only doing IaaS in the cloud, kind of missing a whole bunch of the benefit of doing stuff in the cloud in the first place. I mean, I've worked on a lot of those kind of cloud exit plans for large organizations in the past because regulatory you have to. I mean, the reality of it is not great, right? It's,
And we haven't even talked about data sovereignty,
And on that point.
So thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our speakers for the excellent discussion, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
I did. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.
No.